ACF blocks. For some people, they're a godsend and a bridge to modern WordPress development. And for other people, they're really tough to get right the first time. So we're going to build a carousel block with ACF blocks, and we're going to walk through the process step by step. The first thing we need to do is set up our plugin. So I've created a plugin here. It's called the example ACF carousel block. And let's take a look at our code. You could potentially do this in your theme. A lot of times if I'm doing a theme with a lot of custom blocks, I'll put my ACF blocks in my theme. In this case, though, to make it a little more portable and to share the code, I'm doing it in a plugin. So our plugin right now just has two files, has like the kind of auto-generated README text file and just our plugin, main plugin file, our plugin headers. So the first thing you have to do when setting up a ACF block is you have to build the block.json file. This is a part where a lot of people get stopped. They kind of think they can start with the field groups or they can start with the code, but you really got to start with that block.json file. So we're going to make a folder for our blocks. You can put your blocks anywhere. You just kind of have to pay attention to where you put your blocks. I usually like to make a folder for like blocks or something, and then a separate folder for each ACF block I'm making. It seems like a lot at first, but if you start building a lot of blocks, it actually seems to be a pretty normal and easy to use convention. So we're going to make a folder just for carousel because we're going to call it the carousel block. And I'm just going to build out my block.json file. I often will not start from scratch on a block.json file. I'll go to the documentation. I'll kind of copy a starter one. So that's what we're going to do here. I'm going to copy over a block.json file, and then we're going to kind of modify it as we go. So here's our starting block.json file. We have the name ACF/carousel. You don't have to use ACF. You could actually override that if you want. Then we have the title of our block, a little description, the category and icon of where we'll find our block, some keywords that we might add to be able to search for the block, and then this part here, the ACF key. So everything before that is standard WordPress block.json, but once we add this ACF key, that's basically letting ACF know to take over and to handle the rendering and the building of the block because it's an ACF block. So this is not core Gutenberg, this is the extra stuff that lets us know it's an ACF block. We really just need to pass it two things. We're going to pass it what mode we want it to look in. So we're going to use preview mode so you can kind of see what it looks like, or you can click to edit it. And we're going to pass it a render template. When you create a block, you can either render it with a function or a template. I like to use the render template where I make a separate PHP file because it's very close to how Native Blocks works. And I like to do everything kind of closer to that because it's a good practice for when you move into Native Blocks. So in the same folder as our block.json in our carousel folder, what we're going to do is we're going to make a new file, and we just have to match the name, render.php. Doesn't really matter what you call this file. It just has to match the name that you're passing right here and just sit in the same directory. The last step that we need to do before we build in our custom fields is we need to tell WordPress about our block. Just adding the block.json file, turning on the plugin is not enough. We have the JSON file. We have to point WordPress to that JSON file. Let's go back to our main plugin file. So we're going to write a function. We're going to call it example ACF carousel block, and we're going to add our function to the init action, which means it's going to run anytime WordPress starts. So anytime WordPress starts, our function is going to run, and all we need is to use register block type. Now, what's cool about register block type is this, again, is a default WordPress function. So if you were building native blocks, real WordPress blocks, this would be the same function you would use. And we're just going to use it. And all we need to do is tell it where our block lives. And really, we just need to tell it what directory. We just want to point it to the folder where this block lives, and it's going to know to look for a block.json file. And if we had more than one block, we would just repeat this line of code over and over for each of our different blocks. So we'll pass the directory that we're currently in, then our blocks folder and our carousel folder. So from here, we've added a function to the start of WordPress. We've told it to look for our block.json in this folder. And so if we jump over to WordPress, we should be able to build out our custom field group. In WordPress, we're going to head over to ACF field groups. We're going to add a new field group. It doesn't matter what you call it, but I usually like to say block and then the name of the block that I'm building. I think it makes it a little easier to look at all your field groups in the future. We're only going to add one field for this one, and it's going to be a post field. We're just going to call it posts. We're going to leave all of the settings, except we're going to select multiple values because we're going to build a post carousel, so we want to be able to pick a couple posts. Finally, we need to come down here to our location rules, and assign this to our block. So we're going to open that drop down and we're going to set the first value to block. And then we're going to open the second value and we should see our carousel block. If you don't see your block here, that means it's not finding your block.json file. That means that maybe your plugin's not turned on, maybe your block.json file is not where you thought it was, or there's some sort of mix up there. So if you're not seeing the name of your block, that's the first thing to check. Is my block.json being loaded by WordPress? Save our changes. And now we're going to jump over to a blog post and start using our block. So now we're in the block editor, and what we're going to get to do is actually use our block. So at this point, if we return to our code, we have a block.json file that defined our block. We have a render.php file, but there's nothing actually in this render.php file. So when we make our block, nothing is really going to show up yet because we haven't written the PHP to display our block. However, we will be able to see the custom fields. So let's look for our carousel. So again, nothing's going to show up because there's nothing to render, but we see our custom field over here, and we can switch into the edit mode here, and we can see that there as well. So let's focus on building out our render.php file. I'm going to start by adding a little code to the top that you can actually get off of ACF's documentation page, and I find it super helpful because it kind of lays out what are all the options in this file. Okay, there we go. So this is just a big comment block, but what it's showing us is that when we're inside of our render.php file in the code of our block, these are all the variables we already have access to. We have the block array, which is just all of the information about the block. It's everything from block.json along with all the values and custom fields that get saved. We have this content that's for an advanced feature, which we're not going to use at this point in time. We have this is preview, which we're actually going to use. And what it tells us is, are we in the block editor looking at a preview of the block, or are we on the front end of the website? Because we're writing one chunk of code for both the block editor and the front end, sometimes we'll use that to kind of render things a little bit differently. We have the post ID of the actual post that we're looking at. And then we have the context, which is another advanced variable we're not going to use in this video. The first thing we need to do is get our custom field. Let's head over to our block and let's just assign some posts here so that we have some data to work with. So it's a post carousel, so I'm going to add in all of my example posts so that I can have some examples to look at. And we'll just hit update. Over here, I'm going to get those posts. It's my post field. I'm just going to use get field posts. The great thing about ACF blocks is I'm already inside of my block. I don't have to do anything to get, I don't have to pass any other variables or use any other custom things. The values right there are going to show up right here. In fact, let's variable dump them out and let's see what it looks like. There we go. See, I can see that variable dump. It's an array and it's got the content of all the blog posts. So let's start building our front end markup. We're going to wrap our block in a section element, and you'll see why in a little bit, but it's going to kind of show us where our block starts and stops and how things are a little bit different. So what I'm going to do is copy in some pre-written code here so you don't have to watch me type it out line by line. So this here is pretty standard WordPress PHP. I'm checking if my post field has a value. Then if so, I'm making this carousel element. Then I'm going to loop through, set up the post data using that global post object. I'm going to loop out each carousel item. It's just a post thumbnail wrapped in the permalink, and it's a H2, the post title, wrapped in a permalink. That's going to end my loop and reset my post data. And then later, if there was no post field, say the block loads empty, I'm just going to put no post selected so that something shows up on the back end when you first start the block. So let's save this and just take a look and see if it's rendering on the front end. So let's turn on the preview. All right, so there's my loop, my 4 posts, example 1, example 2. We got our thumbnails and we got our post title, and that's looking great. At this point, we don't have a carousel yet because we haven't added any styles, any JavaScript, anything like that. So right now we're just looking at just a list of posts. So let's add some custom CSS and some custom JavaScript to our block. Let's start with our CSS. We're going to add a new style, and this is a default WordPress option that's going to tell the block editor which styles to load. So if we just want to load kind of a local style that's right here, we can actually just tell it file, and we'll give it a name. We'll just say style.css. We don't have any Sass or a build process or anything. We just have some CSS files. So we're just going to add a new file. to the same folder because it's going to be looking for it just like that render. It's looking for it in the same folder. I'm going to put in style.css. And I'm going to copy over just a little bit of styles for this block. So here's some basic styles. We have the carousel wrapping element, and we have no styles there. We have a few item, styles, what we want them to look like, some responsive styles for larger screens, and a little bit of extra styling for the images. Let's save our block.json file, and then we'll go over to the block editor and see if our file got loaded. Okay, so we've refreshed the page. You can see that I gave them that kind of like 33% width, and we can see that it's working. So our blocks are loading in the styles here. What we're going to do next is load up some JavaScript for our carousel. Now, adding JavaScript to blocks is generally pretty painless, but with ACF blocks, it can get a little tricky. That's because the way core Gutenberg works is it doesn't just expect a JavaScript file, it expects it to be part of this larger Webpack build process where you have these asset.php files that are generated and tell you dependencies and stuff. And when you don't have a build process like we don't have in this plugin, you're not going to get a lot of that like good stuff that's super helpful. So we have to use some of our kind of old school WordPress tricks. So we're actually going to jump back to our main plugin file and we're going to register our scripts with WP register script. And that way, all of our JavaScript is sort of loaded the old-fashioned way, and then it kind of works a lot better. So let's head to our main plugin file. We're going to add a new function here, and it's going to be a classic WP enqueue scripts where we're just going to do WP register style and script. So the first two that we're registering are Flickity, which is a slider library that you can use online. So we're just loading that from a CDN right now. I would maybe bring it into my plugin and copy it locally, but just for the sake of this example, we're just loading the CSS and JavaScript for the Flickity carousel package. Then we're going to register our own custom script. So this script is going to be our own JavaScript that's going to turn on the carousel, and it's going to live, if you see right here, in our blocks/carousel/script.js file. So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to make a new file. I'm going to call it script.js. And I'm going to do WP enqueue scripts. And so what we're doing here is we're registering these, but we're not loading them across the entire website because we're going to let the block editor only load them on pages where we're using the block, which is going to be great for performance. The other thing we have to actually do is we have to duplicate this action and do an admin enqueue scripts. And what that means is we're going to register these on the back end of WordPress too, because when you're in the block editor, we also need access to those because we want our preview to look just as good as the front end. So we're going to save this function. We have our Flickity style, our Flickity script, and our custom script that we're making just for our plugin that sits right here in the script.js file. So let's head back over to block.json and we're going to add those here. So let's start with our style and finish that up right here. And we will just say Flickity. And what's great is you can actually pass it just the name of something you registered here, and it's going to know how to grab it. Then we're going to take a script tag, and we're actually going to do a pretty similar thing. So we're going to say Flickity, because that was the name of the JavaScript that we also loaded. And then we're going to say WP block ACF carousel. And that's only because that's what I named it right here. So whatever I registered the script as, that's what I'm going to load it up as. So I'm telling the block editor, basically, whenever you use this block, load up all of these assets. One of them, we can give the direct file path, but the other ones, we really have to use WP register script to get them to work. The final thing we need to do is actually write our JavaScript that's going to load our carousel. So we loaded the kind of carousel library, but we need to do a little JavaScript in our custom file to initialize that carousel. So first, we're going to make a function. We're going to call it initialize block. It's just going to be a function that is going to grab all of the carousels by class name. So we could use jQuery if we wanted to here, but we're going to try not to because it's always kind of nice to step away from jQuery if we can. But it's a pretty similar approach. We're grabbing all of the class names with isCarousel, and that's because in our render, if our posts field exists, the first thing we do is wrap it in this isCarousel block. So we'll get them, we'll do a basic for loop and loop through them and turn them all on. And what this does is instead of just initiating one, we could actually put multiple carousels on a page and it's going to loop through all of them and then turn them all on. So it's kind of a nice way to handle multiple blocks on the same page. And so This function, when we call it, will turn on all the carousels. It'll pass, these are just some basic options. You can go to the Flickity docs to kind of see what carousel options you want. If you want like icons and arrows and all that sort of stuff, it's all there. The last thing we need to do is call this function. So when do we want to call the function? When do we want to initialize it? Well, it depends. Are we on the front end of the website or the back end of the website? Because again, our block is going to load on the front end of the website and it's going to load on the back end of the website. So we're really going to have to deal with both situations. So let me show how we're going to do that. So we're going to do that with this conditional. We're going to check if window.acf exists. What that means is if it exists, we're on the back end of WordPress and ACF has loaded all of its JavaScript. And then they give us this action, which basically says render block preview, and then the type of block, that's our name. We called it carousel, right? So if we're on the back end of WordPress and we want to run this function to turn on all our carousels, this one is going to work because it's calling this function as part of this action that happens every time you load the block. Or if we're just on the front end of the website, just call the function, load our carousels. So what's nice about this is if I'm on the back end of WordPress and I'm slipping in and out of that preview mode, every time I go to edit my custom field, go back to the preview, this runs again and it calls our function. So let's take a look and see if everything loaded correctly or if I missed any commas or semicolons. Okay, so I've refreshed my page and here we go. We can see our carousel is actually here. It's actually clickable. I can edit it. I can mess around with it. These links are clickable, or I can jump into that edit mode and I can rearrange the order. Maybe I want to put them backwards. Maybe I want this one here. Maybe I want this one there. I could jump back into the preview and boom, it's going to reinitialize the carousel, get everything working perfectly for us. And that's because it's loading all of our JavaScript. It's loading our two Flickity files that we needed, our Flickity CSS and JavaScript, which helps us get all these little arrows and icons and everything set up. And then it's also loading a bunch of our custom JavaScript and CSS, and all of that's kind of wrapped together in the block. So let's hit update and let's jump over to the front end of our website and see if it's working for us. Okay, here we go. Here's the front end of our website. We can see our block is loading. It has everything we need. The carousel is loading and it's loading those assets. And if I were to go to another page on the site, it's not going to load any of those extra assets, which is like super performant. It's really great for keeping our website, top speed and as limited as possible. So everything about this has been really great so far. But what if we wanted to take it up another level and we wanted to use some of the native Gutenberg stuff? Let's take a look at what sort of block supports we have available to us. Let's head into our block.json file. And what we're going to do is we're going to open up the supports key. Supports is a native Gutenberg feature, but we have access to it in ACF. You can check the documentation for the full list of things you can support, but we're going to turn on a couple of them. We're going to turn on align and we'll say wide. We're going to give the option to make our block wide if we want to. We're also going to turn on some color options. We're going to give the option to turn on and off colors using the built-in native color palette that comes with our theme. So when we go into the block editor, we'll have access to all these things, and then it'll be on us to use them in our plugin. So we're jumping back into the edit post screen. We're going to click on our block here, and we're going to see that now we have this extra styles tab open because we turned on a few styles. We also have the alignment option here. So let's test out the alignment first. Let's go align wide, and boom, it works. Perfect. Align wide. Let's go over to our colors and let's give it a background color. We'll say orange. Yeah, working pretty well. And we'll change the link color for these links right here to, how's that, pink? It's a little hard to read. How about that? There we go. And we're going to update it. And so if you see, all I did was add a couple of lines of code to my block.json, and the color and the alignment just seems to work out of the box. Does it work on the front end? Let's take a look and see. So I'm back on the front end of the website and none of my cool styles showed up, right? It looks like I don't have anything. Maybe the color on one of them worked, but one of them didn't. So we got to get this working in our template. It works on the back end, but it didn't work on our template. There's kind of a good reason for it, but it's a little funky. So let's take a look. So in our render.php, we're going to use a core WordPress function that's called get block wrapper attributes. And what get block wrapper attributes does is it takes all those settings that we just turned on, the styles, the alignment, the colors, and it's going to give us those as classes on our section element. So In the past, in ACF blocks, you would have to kind of write all of these conditionals to check for them. And sometimes you still do, depending on your theme and what settings. But for alignment and color, we can actually use this function to spit out all of those settings on our section element. However, there is one sort of thing we do have to pay attention to here. If you use this function on the back end of WordPress in an ACF block, it doesn't actually work that well. It really only helps us on the front end. So we're going to do it in a conditional using our isPreview variable that we have. What we can say is if we're in the preview, don't use this function at all. If we're in the front end of the website, use this function and give us all those classes that the block editor does by default. Okay, so I've taken this, I've put this isPreview. If we're not in the preview, echo this out. If we are, just echo out an empty string and move on. So we're going to save that. And what that's going to do is when we're on the front end of our website, it's actually going to run this function here. So before I refresh the page, let's just load up the inspectors and let's grab our section. So here's our section, right? It doesn't really have any other classes or anything like that. We can see our content that was inside our Carousel and all the Flickity stuff. But the section element, that's the only block, it's sitting right at the top level, doesn't have any other classes or something. So what we're going to do is turn this on. We're going to save it. We're going to refresh. Now check out our section. Not only does it have the styles, it has the alignment, it has the color, it has everything we need here. But if you look here, it actually is spitting out all the things we need. It has the name of the block, WP block, ACF Carousel. It has the background, has the background color, the align white. It does all those classes for us. So it's super helpful to spit this stuff out automatically. I don't have to write a bunch of code to do it. But why can't I do it on the back end? Let's just take a quick detour and take a look why. So when we're on the back end in the block editor with an ACF block, you'll notice here that my section doesn't have anything, right? Because we're not spitting out all that code. It's because there's another div outside of it that ACF adds when you're only on the back end. And this trips up a lot of people because sometimes your styles are very specifically scoped to classes and stuff, and you're not expecting all of these classes to be on a div one level above the actual element that we wrote in our code. So it's one sort of discrepancy between the front and the back end is this extra level of a div. So that's why I find it's kind of easiest to use the function that exists, but only on the front end. And then on the back end, all of these classes, all these styles that we turned on and off, it actually handles them pretty easily. So it just updates the code right there. And then on the front end, we're just spitting it out on our element right here. So as a quick recap, we built out our block, we wrote our block.json file, we registered our block with WordPress, we enqueued a bunch of scripts and styles for our block, we added those back to our block.json file, and finally we built a nice PHP template to spit out our carousel. The whole source code for this is going to be available online. I'm hoping to do a big, deeper dive into ACF and actually take each of these steps even slower and even deeper. If that sounds interesting to you, please comment and let me know, or let me know if there's other spots of ACF that we haven't really dug into. And I hope this helps you tackle your first or 50th ACF block.